Kristina, Keneally, thanks very much for your time. This is the first of the stillbirth annual forum since the Senate inquiry. What do you want to see come out of this particular gathering?
Well, this is the first national stillbirth forum since we've handed down that recommendation, a first national set of recommendations to reduce stillbirth. We've got a target coming out of that, 20% reduction over the next 3 years. Many of the researchers here think we can exceed that. But what we really want to see here is progress on something called the National Baby Bundle, the Safer Baby Bundle. And that's already been signed up to by New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland. It works with parents and with clinicians. It gives the right advice to parents. It gives the right advice to clinicians. It's an approach that's worked in places like the Netherlands and Scotland, and there's no reason it can't work here in Australia.
I believe that you also want some reform when it comes to bereavement payments. Can you tell us exactly what the situation is now in that context?
There is a very strange discrepancy. In fact, some might say it's rather grotesque in our social welfare system. And that is a bereavement payment that goes to the parents of babies who tragically die after birth. And a baby's heart only has to beat a couple of times before that bereavement payment is given should they tragically die. But for parents whose babies die in stillbirth, whose hearts don't beat after delivery, they're not eligible for that payment. And I think many people would look at this and say that is a significant anomaly. Of course, no amount of money can take away the grief a parent feels, but there are additional costs. And whether your baby's heart beats after birth or not, you're still going to face those costs, which include counselling, funeral costs, so time out of the workforce. This is a small way that the Commonwealth Government can recognise the grief and the trauma that parents of stillborn babies go through and to afford them the same respect and support that parents of neonatal deaths receive. And we call on the government to do this. I'm quite optimistic that Minister Hunt and the government will see the sense in this, and I hope we'll take up this opportunity to right what really is a very historical wrong.
It absolutely makes sense, and given the bipartisanship of the Senate inquiry, let's hope you're right and that there is some reform in that regard. On some other issues now, the Immigration Minister wants greater powers under Section 501 of the Migration Act to cancel visas. Why doesn't Labor support the proposed toughening of that particular section?
Well, Kieran, Section 501 of the Migration Act already provides the minister with extremely broad powers to remove a person, a non-citizen, from Australia if the minister believes they're going to engage in criminal activity in Australia. It is not been clear since the government introduced this legislation in the last parliament why they need to change this. There has been a Senate inquiry already held. 16 of the 17 submitters opposed this change. The only submission that did support it was the Department of Home Affairs. It will go back to a Senate inquiry. It really is up to the government to prove why this change is needed and what the minister can't do under the current broad powers that the minister already has. Kieran, I have to say this would potentially see teenagers from New Zealand who've lived their whole life in Australia banned from Australia for something as minor as shoplifting. And quite frankly, it's up to the government to explain why they think these extraordinary changes are needed. The reality is the minister already has quite sweeping and broad powers. I say, Kieran, this is a government that doesn't have anything to say about the stagnant economy, the stagnant wages, the low wage growth. They have no answer to the Reserve Bank's call for them to stimulate the economy. They could bring forward infrastructure spending. There's nothing for them to talk about because they have no economic plan for Australia. So they're taking on these types of resurrecting, really, the dead of their legislation that failed in the last parliament.
On a related issue, you called for that individual Kassam to be blocked from entering Australia to attend the CPAC conference. In hindsight, was that a mistake? Because you've probably achieved more publicity for him in that particular event than otherwise would have been achieved.
Kieran, we cannot in Australia sit silently by and watch the extreme right, the alt-right, take root in this country. We're not immune to the extremist white supremacy movements that have sprung up overseas, and the internet is spreading it to our shores. We can't ignore the fact that one of our own took his murderous intent to New Zealand. What we are seeing this weekend in Sydney is a group of gun-toting, gun-loving NRA members coming to Australia, a group of people who have vilified the Muslim faith, Muslim Australians who are going to see welcomed on stage, people like Mr. Kassam, welcomed on stage by Liberal senators and MPs, a man who has said that the Quran is fundamentally evil and who has said that Islamic faith is a fascistic and totalitarian ideology. Now, this government, the Liberal government, banned Milo Yiannopoulos for saying that the Muslim faith was alien and barbaric. I cannot understand why Scott Morrison, who so strongly defends religious freedom, isn't standing up for the religious freedom of Muslim Australians. And I can understand Scott Morrison not standing up on the side of Australia's gun laws. Is Scott Morrison, is this Liberal government on the side of Australians and our gun laws, or are they on the side of the NRA and the pro-gun speakers that are coming to this conference this weekend?
Kristina Keneally, there's also the issue of freedom of speech. Don't you also have to defend that particular freedom as well in this context?
Kieran, there is in our laws already, in Section 501 of the Migration Act, a change brought in by Tony Abbott, a recognition that speech does harm. And so the Minister for Immigration, under the Section 501 of the Migration Act, already has the power, as introduced by Tony Abbott, to bar someone from Australia who will vilify a section of the Australian community or create discord within the community. It is, in fact, their speech that does that. And that's a recognition that free speech is not absolute. It butts up against other rights, including the freedom of religion. And quite frankly, it is up to the Prime Minister to show the leadership, to explain in his mind and in his government's approach, where does the right for free speech end and where does the right for freedom of religion begin? Because none of these rights are absolute. They do exist in a contest. The government has come down on the side of Muslim Australians to practice their faith free of vilification when they banned Milo Yiannopoulos. The question is, why aren't they doing the same thing here with Mr. Kassam?
Kristina Keneally, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.